It was Christmas Eve, 2023, and the city was cloaked in silence, save for the occasional crunch of footsteps on snow-covered sidewalks. The air was crisp, almost biting, and the frost etched delicate patterns on the windows of my apartment building. I had just come home after a long shift at the diner, the kind of night where every customer seemed to linger a little longer, soaking in the festive cheer. My apartment, a modest studio on the third floor, wasn't much, but it was mine. The small artificial tree I'd set up glowed warmly in the corner, its string lights reflecting off the frosted windows. It smelled faintly of pine from a cheap candle I'd picked up at a dollar store. I was ready to settle in for a quiet night with some old Christmas movies. Just as I sat down, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was from Rachel, my upstairs neighbor. She'd moved in about 6 months ago, and though we weren't exactly close, we exchanged friendly nods in the hallway. "Hey, can you hear someone moving around in the hallway? It's been going on for a while, creeping me out." I paused and strained to listen, but the only sound was the faint hum of the heater. I texted back, "Haven't noticed anything. You okay?" She didn't reply, and I shrugged it off. The building wasn't exactly in the best part of town, and noises in the hallway were nothing unusual. I turned on the TV, letting the cheerful voices of holiday specials fill the room. An hour passed, and I was beginning to forget Rachel's text when I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. They were faint at first, almost like someone was trying not to be heard, but they grew louder as they approached my door. My body tensed. The footsteps paused just outside, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. I muted the TV, every muscle in my body on edge. Then came a soft knock. Not a regular knock. It was a single, measured tap. My heart raced as I approached the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but the dimly lit hallway. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, before stepping back and double-checking the locks. I texted Rachel. "Someone knocked on my door. Did they knock on yours?" Her reply came almost instantly. "Yes. Don't open it. Keep your door locked." I wanted to brush it off as some prank, maybe a kid messing around. But as the night dragged on, the tension in the building seemed to thicken. Around midnight, the soft tapping returned, not just on my door but on the walls of the hallway. It was faint but persistent, like fingers trailing along the paint. At 1 a.m., I heard Rachel's voice through the ceiling. She was talking to someone, but her tone was hushed, almost nervous. I couldn't make out the words, but the one-sided conversation sent chills down my spine. I texted her again. "Who are you talking to?" No reply. The tapping turned to muffled thuds, and then silence. I decided I couldn't sit idly any longer. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the closet and opened my door just a crack. The hallway was empty, but something felt off. The air was cold, colder than it should have been inside the building. I locked the door again and retreated to the couch, keeping the bat within arm's reach. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard Rachel scream. It wasn't just a cry of alarm. It was pure, unbridled terror. The sound cut off abruptly, leaving the building eerily quiet. My hands trembled as I called 911. "Please, you have to send someone to my building," I stammered, giving the address. "Something happened to my neighbor." I heard her scream. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but every second felt like an eternity. I paced the room, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes darted to the peephole, but I couldn't bring myself to look through it again. Then, the doorknob jiggled. My breath caught in my throat as I froze in place, staring at the door. A low, guttural growl echoed from the other side. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. The sound was wet and gurgling, sending a wave of nausea through me. The sirens outside couldn't have come soon enough. The growling stopped abruptly, and I heard heavy footsteps retreating down the hallway. I stayed put, clutching the bat, until the officers knocked on my door. When I opened it, they were already heading upstairs to Rachel's apartment. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. Her door was ajar, and the scene inside was like something out of a nightmare. The furniture was overturned, Christmas decorations were shattered, and the walls were scratched as if by claws. But Rachel was gone. No blood, No signs of a struggle, just an empty apartment and an unsettling silence. On the kitchen table, the officers found a note scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Merry Christmas. See you next year." The investigation turned up nothing. The police said there were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence of who or what had been there. Rachel was officially listed as a missing person, but deep down, I knew she wasn't coming back. I moved out a week later, unable to shake the feeling that whatever had come for Rachel might come for me next. Every Christmas since, I've been haunted by nightmares of that growl, of the note on the table, and of those slow, deliberate footsteps outside my door. And every Christmas Eve, I make sure I'm never alone. It was Christmas Eve, 2023, and the snowstorm that had been predicted for days had finally hit. The streets were nearly deserted, blanketed in thick layers of snow, with only the occasional car braving the treacherous conditions. I had just finished visiting my parents on the other side of town and was making my way back to my apartment, an old brick building nestled in a quiet neighborhood. The roads were slick, and visibility was nearly zero, so I decided to pull into a small, run-down gas station to wait out the storm. The station was barely lit, with a single flickering neon sign advertising its name, Maple Ridge Gas and Goods. Inside, the shelves were half empty, and the place had the kind of eerie silence that made your skin crawl. The attendant, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and piercing eyes, barely looked up from his magazine as I entered. I grabbed a coffee from the ancient machine in the corner and decided to browse the aisles to kill time. There wasn't much, some canned goods, batteries, and a few dusty Christmas decorations. I had just picked up a pack of gum when I felt it, the sensation of being watched. I turned, expecting to see the attendant, but he was still behind the counter, engrossed in whatever he was reading. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was in the store with me. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light, and the cold from outside seemed to seep into the building, chilling me to the bone. Shaking off the unease, I paid for the coffee and gum and returned to my car. The snow had piled up even more, and it was clear I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. I decided to park in the far corner of the lot, away from the gas pumps, and wait for the storm to die down. As I sat there, sipping my coffee and listening to the wind howl, I noticed movement in my rearview mirror. A dark figure was walking across the lot, barely visible through the swirling snow. At first, I thought it was just another stranded traveler, but something about the way they moved set off alarm bells in my head. Their gait was jerky, almost unnatural, and they seemed to be heading straight for my car. I locked the doors and turned off the interior light, hoping to make myself less noticeable. The figure stopped about 10 feet from my car, just standing there, partially obscured by the snow. I couldn't make out any details. No face, no clothing, just a dark silhouette. Then, slowly, they raised a hand and pointed directly at me. Panic set in as I fumbled for my phone to call for help, but of course, there was no signal. The storm had knocked out all the nearby towers. I honked the horn, hoping to scare them off or alert the gas station attendant, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, they began to move again, circling the car, their hand dragging along the frosted windows as they went. I could hear the faint scrape of their fingers against the glass, and it was then I noticed something strange. The snow around them wasn't disturbed. There were no footprints, no sign that they were actually walking on the ground. It was as if they were gliding over the snow, untouched by the storm. Desperation took over, and I started the engine, ready to risk the icy roads if it meant getting away from this nightmare. But as soon as I put the car in gear, the figure slammed their hands against the driver's side window. The sound was deafening, and I could see cracks forming in the glass. Their face was inches from mine, but it was wrong, twisted and hollow, with empty black pits where their eyes should have been. I floored the accelerator, the tires spinning on the icy pavement before finally catching traction. The car lurched forward, and I swerved out of the lot, narrowly missing one of the gas pumps. In the rearview mirror, I could see the figure standing in the middle of the lot, watching me as I disappeared into the storm. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, my heart pounding and my hands shaking on the wheel. Eventually, I found myself in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. The place was warm and brightly lit, a stark contrast to the nightmare I had just escaped. I stumbled inside, barely able to speak, and ordered a cup of coffee to calm my nerves. The waitress, a kind woman with a thick southern drawl, noticed my disheveled state and asked if I was okay. I hesitated, not sure how to explain what had happened, but I told her about the gas station and the figure in the snow. Her expression changed immediately, her face going pale. "Was it Maple Ridge Gas and Goods?" she asked. I nodded, and she let out a shaky breath. "That place has been abandoned for years. Burned down in 2015. Nobody goes near it, not after what happened there." I stared at her, my mind racing. "What do you mean?" "I was just there. The attendant." She shook her head. "No, honey, there's no one there. Hasn't been for a long time." I left the diner in a daze, the waitress's words echoing in my head. When I finally made it home, I looked up the gas station online. Sure enough, the news articles confirmed her story. The building had burned down nearly a decade ago, killing the owner and 3 customers who had been trapped inside during a snowstorm. To this day, I can't explain what I saw that night. I haven't driven in a snowstorm since, and I avoid that part of town altogether. But every Christmas Eve, when the wind howls and the snow begins to fall, I can't help but glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing there, waiting for me. It was Christmas night, 2023, and the heavy snowfall had turned my small town into a picture-perfect winter wonderland. My girlfriend, Amy, and I had planned a quiet evening at home, enjoying the glow of our Christmas tree and some hot cocoa. We had recently moved into a cozy old house on the edge of town, and this was our first holiday there. The house had its quirks, creaking floorboards, drafty windows, but we loved it, imperfections and all. Around 10 p.m., Amy decided to turn in for the night. She had an early shift at the hospital the next day, and I promised to lock up before heading to bed myself. The house was silent except for the occasional pop of the wood in the fireplace. I sat in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed the faint sound of jingling bells. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe kids playing in the snow or someone walking a dog. But when I looked out the window, the street was empty, and the snow was untouched. Shrugging it off as my imagination, I returned to my phone, but then I heard it again, louder this time, coming from somewhere inside the house. I froze, listening intently. The sound was faint but distinct, like the jingling of sleigh bells, and it seemed to be coming from upstairs. My heart began to race as I remembered Amy mentioning that the previous owners had left behind a box of old Christmas decorations in the attic. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now I couldn't shake the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way upstairs. The house felt colder than usual, and the old wooden steps groaned under my weight. At the top of the stairs, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving me in deafening silence. I hesitated, debating whether to wake Amy, but I didn't want to alarm her if it was nothing. I opened the attic door, and the cold hit me like a wall. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the faint beam of my flashlight. The box of decorations was exactly where Amy had said it would be, tucked in the corner beneath a dusty sheet. I approached it cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. As I reached for the box, I heard it again. The jingling of bells, this time directly behind me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand, but the attic was empty. The sound continued, moving around me, circling like some invisible presence. My breath came in shallow gasps, visible in the freezing air. Summoning my courage, I yanked the sheet off the box. Inside were the usual decorations, glass ornaments, tinsel, a string of old lights, but what caught my eye was a small, tarnished bell. It looked ancient, its surface covered in intricate engravings, and as I picked it up, the jingling stopped. A wave of unease washed over me as I stared at the bell. It felt unnaturally cold, and the longer I held it, the more I felt like I was being watched. I shoved it back into the box, slammed the lid shut, and hurried out of the attic, locking the door behind me. I tried to shake off the feeling as I climbed into bed next to Amy, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the house set my nerves on edge, and I couldn't stop thinking about that bell. Sometime after midnight, I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a loud crash. Amy sat up beside me, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. "Stay here." I crept downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The living room was a mess. The Christmas tree had toppled over, ornaments shattered across the floor. The air was icy, and I could see my breath as I moved toward the front door, which was wide open. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but there were no footprints in the snow outside. The yard was pristine, untouched. As I closed and locked the door, I noticed something on the floor near the fallen tree. A trail of wet footprints leading from the fireplace to the front door. They were small, like those of a child, but the shape was off. The toes were too long, almost claw-like, and the prints were smeared with soot. My stomach turned as I followed the trail back to the fireplace. The hearth was empty, but the ashes were disturbed, as if something, or someone, had crawled out. A sudden noise from upstairs made me whirl around. It was Amy, screaming. I sprinted up the stairs, my mind racing with every horrifying possibility. I found her in the bedroom, standing by the window, her face pale and her hands trembling. She pointed wordlessly to the glass, and when I looked, my blood ran cold. Outside, standing in the snow, was a figure. It was small, no taller than a child, but its proportions were grotesque. Its limbs were too long, its body hunched, and its face was obscured by shadows. It was holding something, a small, tarnished bell. I grabbed Amy and pulled her away from the window. We barricaded ourselves in the bedroom, pushing the dresser against the door and calling the police. The operator assured us that officers were on their way, but it felt like an eternity before the flashing lights appeared outside. When the police searched the property, they found no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no bell. They chalked it up to a prank or our imaginations running wild. But Amy and I know what we saw. We moved out of that house a week later, leaving behind the Christmas decorations, the bell, and the nightmares that came with them. To this day, I can't hear the sound of jingling bells without feeling a chill down my spine, and I'll never forget the thing that stared at us through the window that Christmas night. It was Christmas Eve, 2023, and I was reluctantly driving to my parents' house for dinner. The roads were blanketed in snow, and the visibility was terrible. My parents lived about an hour away, in a rural town surrounded by dense woods. Every year, they insisted on hosting Christmas dinner, and every year, I found myself dreading the drive. But this time felt different, heavier somehow, as if the silence of the snow held a warning I couldn't quite decipher. I was about halfway there when my car radio began to cut out. Static filled the cabin, and I hit the console in frustration. It was a new car, a gift to myself after a long year, and it shouldn't have been having issues. But the static persisted, and then I heard something faint beneath it, a voice. It was distorted, almost unrecognizable, but it sounded like someone whispering my name. I turned off the radio and focused on the road, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. The snow was coming down harder now, and the road ahead was barely visible. My headlights caught something moving on the side of the road, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall and pale, its limbs unnaturally long, and it was watching me. I hit the gas, my heart pounding. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to stick around to find out. The car sped down the icy road, and for a moment, I felt relief. But then I saw it again, standing in the middle of the road, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I swerved, narrowly missing it, and my car skidded into a ditch. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me in silence except for the howling wind. I tried to start the car, but it wouldn't turn over. My phone had no signal, and I was miles from the nearest house. I sat there for a moment, trying to think. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. I decided to walk to my parents' house. It wasn't far, maybe a 20-minute hike through the woods. Grabbing my coat and flashlight, I stepped out into the freezing night. The snow muffled my footsteps as I made my way through the trees. The flashlight cast long shadows, and every snap of a branch made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing standing there, but the woods were empty. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It came from somewhere ahead of me, deep in the trees. I froze, my breath visible in the icy air. The growl came again, closer this time, and I began to run. The trees blurred around me as I sprinted through the snow, my flashlight bouncing wildly. I could hear it behind me now, crashing through the underbrush, its growls growing louder. I didn't dare look back. I tripped over a root and fell hard into the snow, the flashlight flying out of my hand. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight just as the growls stopped. I turned around, shining the beam into the darkness, but there was nothing there. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking as I continued through the woods. I could see the faint glow of my parents' house in the distance, and I felt a surge of relief. But that relief was short-lived. As I approached the house, I noticed something strange. The windows were dark, and the front door was wide open. My parents were meticulous about keeping the house locked, especially at night. And this wasn't like them at all. I stepped inside, calling out to them, but the house was silent. The living room was untouched, the Christmas tree still lit and surrounded by gifts. But there was a strange smell in the air, metallic and sharp, like blood. I followed the smell to the kitchen, and my stomach turned at what I saw. The back door was open, snow blowing in, and the floor was covered in bloody footprints. They were too large to be human, the toes elongated and clawed. Panicking, I ran upstairs to my parents' bedroom, but it was empty. The bed was unmade, and there were more bloody footprints leading to the window, which was open despite the freezing cold. I searched the entire house, but they were gone. I called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. They arrived about an hour later, and I explained everything. They searched the woods and the surrounding area but found no trace of my parents or the creature. The only thing they found was my car, still stuck in the ditch. The police tried to reassure me, saying it was probably a bear or a large animal that had wandered into the house. But I knew better. Those footprints weren't from any animal I'd ever seen, and the growls I heard in the woods weren't from a bear. I stayed in a hotel that night, unable to sleep, and the next day, I packed up what little I had and left town for good. My parents were never found, and their disappearance remains a mystery. To this day, I can't drive through a snowstorm without thinking about that night, about the thing in the woods, and about the bloodstains on the kitchen floor. Some Christmas memories are best forgotten.